Jim has done a lot of amazing work over multiple decades around electricity rates and fair rates, and he's written multiple guides and books that are really great resources, and done work to fight against fixed fee increases. And yeah, I think he is just really a wealth of knowledge and really appreciate that he accepted our offer to be here and yeah, talk a little bit about this work around data centers that he's been digging into most recently.
So I'm an economist. I had an undergraduate professor who had worked for an electric utility during his grad school days and got a group of us in the environmental economics program interested in electricity. And that stuck with me for a career. I have the good fortune last year of giving a presentation up in Bellingham at the college that I went to, and Howard Teasley, who lives in Vancouver, that professor came down to Bellingham for my presentation, and I've stayed in touch with him really for my entire career. Uh, this presentation on the risk and cost of large new load was one that I presented to a group, a secret society that Liz and Al and I are members of. Uh, and so we get this to slideshow mode here. Once bit of clutter. Uh, And this is the case of multi-trillion dollar tech companies challenging multi-billion dollar electric utilities. And we are all clutter on the floor of this fight between some colossus. To understand data centers, how big they are. I mean, a typical residence has a connected load of about 10 kilowatts and an average load of about 1 kilowatt, meaning we use over the 8,760 hours of the year, about 8,760 kilowatt hours. A supermarket has a connected load that's 30 times as big and consumption that's 250 times as big. A regional shopping mall, maybe 2 megawatts. An oil refinery, maybe 80 megawatts. When what we used to think of as our really, really big industrial customers. But these hyperscale data centers are truly colossal compared even to an oil refinery. One under construction in Portugal right now that's 1,300 megawatts. And they will run almost continuously, or many of them will run almost continuously, or they expect to run almost continuously. And there's frankly a lot of uncertainty about how much they will run. These are really, really big companies. This graphic compares on the left stacked bar the 10 largest electric utilities in the United States: Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, New England Electric, Commonwealth Edison, Southern Company, Duke, and others, all put together compared to the market capitalization of the Magnificent Seven, the seven biggest data companies. Now, these data companies are global, and these electric utilities are regional. It's not terribly surprising that they're bigger. But from my career, the power company has always been kind of a big entity. And I considered myself to be David fighting Goliath. But compared to the size of these data companies, even the biggest power companies are kind of rounding errors. As one person said, Google could buy Pacific Gas and Electric with its couch change. In many ways, the AI boom is driving the economy right now. The US stock market is up stupendously over the last 4 years. Over half of this market capital growth is in just 10 firms that are in AI. One third of the new capital being invested in the economy-wide, is going to AI. And the promise of AI is incredible. You know, the head of NVIDIA thinks that we can quintuple gross domestic product over the next 30 years with AI. And if things go well, we'll all have personal digital servants, which will be 3D devices that live in our house and do what we ask them to. They'll mop the floor, they'll do the laundry, they'll wash the dishes, and almost anything else we ask them to do. Uh, but what if it goes wrong? Their current revenues into AI is about $50 billion a year. Their data center investment is $3 trillion. That's less than a 2% return on investment, even before considering the depreciation expense. Once depreciation is included, they're losing money and losing money very quickly. Things could shrink faster than they grow. This is going to be a wild ride. Data center planning is going faster than chip manufacturers. Amory Levins has a great paper. I absolutely recommend it. It's not very long. Artificial intelligence meets natural stupidity. The utilities that are fielding hundreds of requests for huge amounts of power, but only a fraction of that demand will ultimately be realized. What Amory did is he compared the amount of load that the utilities have said they're expecting from data centers to the amount of load that would be produced if all of the chips produced by all of the chip producers got put into data centers. And there's about 5 times as much load expected by the utilities as there is load being produced by the industry. There's a bunch of areas where new load causes impacts on existing customers. In first, new stuff generally costs more than existing stuff. In generation, because wind and solar have gotten so cheap, maybe not. But in transmission and utility distribution system investment, definitely transformers and poles and wires and transmission towers cost a lot more than they used to. There's a lot of reliability risk. The large customer demand may grow faster than supply, meaning the reserves that are currently in the power system that keep everything reliable could be sucked up. There are big issues of transmission availability and transmission reliability. The data centers, particularly in Virginia, where they're being clustered, is going to put real strain on transmission availability. That could create real reliability issues for others. Issues in rate design go into one of these, but in general, high load factor customers pay too little the way rates are made by U.S. utility. And finally, there's a stranded cost risk. What if we build a whole bunch of power and transmission to serve these folks, and in 3 or 5 or 7 years, they figure out a way to do 10 times as much computing with 1/10 as much electricity, leaving a whole bunch of investment in the power system stranded. So I'll start with the first of these. New stuff costs more than existing stuff. California has built a lot of new transmission to connect their new solar farms in the desert area around Barstow to the load centers in Los Angeles and San Francisco Bay Area. The cost of the new transmission is over 12 cents a kilowatt hour. That is divided by the kilowatt hours that are flowing through it. The average transmission price, about a third of that. So it's driving up transmission costs for everybody to add transmission. One solution is to require the large customers to bring their own new resources or enter into contracts in which they pay for new resources. The reliability risk is a big deal. If large customer demand grows faster than system supply, we're seeing the effect of that in the PJM, Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland capacity market. Load has, for the rest of us, has gone almost nowhere. Load for data centers has gone up sharply, and the capacity market is strained, and everybody is paying higher prices. And I'll get into an example of this capacity market thing at the end. The growth is very concentrated geographically. You're not seeing data centers built in high-cost power areas like New England and California. They're being built in lower-cost areas. And the problem is those lower cost areas in many cases are lower cost because they've had very little growth and nothing new has been built. And now all of a sudden a lot new is going to be built and those low cost areas may not be low cost anymore. Uh, but here again, the solution is to make the companies bring their own. Transmission availability is a big deal. It takes 2 years to build a data center. It takes 10 years to build new transmission. There's a technical fix here. You can reconductor existing transmission with new technology of transmission cables, but that's expensive, and that leaves us with the possible stranded cost risk. You also have to add terminal capacity. You have to add transmission substation capacity at both ends, and that's not cheap. And the equipment for those substation upgrades is back ordered. So you're looking at years, not months, to to upgrade transmission. The cost allocation issue that I'll spend a little bit of time on here in a little bit uh, is that fixed costs are generally classified as demand related in utility rate studies. And those demand related costs get allocated on some measure of demand. If that happens, the AI customers will cause higher marginal costs for baseload capacity that they need, but pay average costs. And those baseload costs will get mixed in with cheaper capacity for peaking. And the result will be that the AI customers will underpay for the baseload resources that they need. The stranded investment risk is very real. And I think, frankly, that there are parts of the country, I think that the PJM area, the Virginia node in particular, and there's node data centers around Georgia, uh, are at grave risk. The data centers get built quickly, but the servers inside only last a few years. If AI gets smarter and can function with fewer data centers or with data centers that use lower power chips, uh, oh, uh, there's a real risk that the rest of us could be left with costs that were incurred to serve data centers going forward. So I'm gonna stop there before I get into this slightly more technical piece on cost allocation and see if folks have questions on what I've said so far.
Any
So
questions? Anybody?
yeah, so a lot of our focus, video on too. So a lot of our focus has been around rural electric cooperatives and how they're going to be impacted by data centers. I'm in Missouri, and so far we have not really seen that pop up in really any rural places. Is that a similar trend that you've been seeing and following this, or is it IOUs mostly, or have you seen a mix?
The data center companies are really smart. Let's not be confused about that. I mean, artificial intelligence is wonderful, but natural intelligence is also pretty good, and they've acquired a lot of that. They're locating where their focus is A, where can we get approval to build? They're in a hurry. Two, where can we get the power we need quickly? They're in a hurry. Third, where can we get power at a reasonable cost? They're frugal. They're not as frugal as other industries. They're willing to pay more for their power. In general, they're locating where there are big utilities near big transmission interconnections in low-cost regions. Uh, some of those will fall within the traditional service territories of rural utilities. Uh, I'm not aware of any big centers that are being built in co-op systems, but I know, for example, a small municipal, Burbank, California, is in the LA area. It's a 300 megawatt utility. They have an application for a 400 megawatt data center. A data center that would consume more power than all 50,000 homes and businesses in Burbank today. And they're kind of scratching their head with how do we be a good utility and serve demand. That's our job. But also make sure that we protect our other customers and the bulk of the economy in our community. So I'm sure the problem has or soon will show up for a co-op. I also do a lot of stuff on electric vehicles. And Chris Nelder, who used to be with Consumer Union, wrote a paper a couple of years ago on what if a major truck stop that now pumps thousands of gallons of diesel fuel an hour became a major electric truck fueling center. And he gave an example of an actual truck stop in a rural utility service territory uh, in the Intermountain West. And the electric truck stop would draw more power than all 30,000 consumers of that rural utility. Just one electric truck stop, about a 30 megawatt truck stop. Well, 30 megawatts is a little leaguer in the data field now. The gigascalers are building 1,000 megawatt centers. The one that XAI built in Memphis that's running off of trailer mounted diesel generators because the power company couldn't get power to it quickly. Is about 600 megawatts. So it's just a whole different scale.
On your comment and the risk of the overbuild and what we're already seeing, I've seen that pop up with different municipal utility conversations. And there could be a high likelihood that they're going to try to rapidly adapt and grow and might have a bunch of excess generation in different parts of the country.
Uh, Predictions are notoriously difficult to make, especially about the future.
Fair enough.
I mean, in the very beginning of my career, loads were growing at 4, 5, 6% a year in the late 70s, in the 60s and into the 70s, and utilities were building like crazy, coal and nuclear plants all across the country. When the bill for those came due and electric rates went up sharply, what got me into this profession, loads leveled out, and over the last 35 years, electric load growth in the US has been near zero. And that's partly, there's been lots of population growth and lots of houses built and lots of shopping centers built. But an awful lot of our major industrial load has gone away and been offshored. And so we've been able to continue to serve the growing population load with existing generation and transmission. We haven't built much transmission really for 30 years in this country. But now that we're electrifying homes to reduce fossil dependence and adding data centers, loads are growing again and not expected to grow as fast as they did in the 60s and 70s. I mean, they were looking at 2, 3, 4% growth, and we had years of 5 and 6% growth. But the power plant construction industry isn't really geared up to build like they were then. So we're going to have shortages in some places. All right, I'm going to go into a fairly quick, I hope it goes quick. I haven't done this before. Uh, little piece on cost allocation. Are you seeing my screen on cost allocation?
Yeah.
I need somebody to answer.
Yes. Can you
Okay.
hear me? Okay.
All right. So cost allocation is where the cost of the whole power system gets divided up among the customers. And it's, part of what I did for a career is doing cost allocation studies, mostly for consumer advocate groups and public power utilities. So we're going to start with sort of the system hourly power consumption. It's very low in the middle of the night. It rises in the morning. It goes up. It peaks sometime in the evening. And it used to peak in the middle of the day, but we now have enough solar covering the middle of the day that the peaks are showing up at 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. Uh, and utilities have to have resource to serve all of that. And I'm going to give a very simplified version of this to make it, I hope, understandable. Of that load, I've put 50 megawatts of data center at the bottom here, and everything else is above that. And I put in the data center load as continuous across all hours. That's a little oversimplified, but it's pretty much the situation. So utilities use different kinds of resources to meet load. They might use nuclear plants to serve their base load needs, and combined cycle plants to serve their intermediate needs, and simple cycle gas turbines to serve their peak needs. Now, the smart utility today will be using wind and solar and storage to serve much of this, but I'm going to keep this to a kind of leave it in the 1960s somewhere technologically to make the example here. And what it comes down to is the data centers really need nuclear or something, some baseload resource. And the rest of us need a mix of baseload, intermediate, and peaking resources. But that's not how most cost allocation studies get done. The capital cost of these resources is quite different. A new nuclear estimated to cost about $9,000 a kilowatt to build. New combined cycle, about 2,000, new simple cycle, 1,000. And I'm intentionally putting nuclear in here because it's a caricature of a capital cost resource. And our system needs about 100 kW of nuclear and 200 of combined cycle and 100 of simple cycle to meet its load. And that would cost $1.4 million in our test year to serve the load. 64% of that capital cost would be from the nuclear side. But now I'm not looking at fuel costs. Obviously, the nuclear plant's going to have very low fuel costs, and the combined cycle and simple cycle plants are going to have higher fuel costs. But it's just cost allocation piece that I'm talking about is the capital cost. How it typically works is it all gets averaged together. 400 kW, $1.4 million, that's $3,500 a kW. So not 9,000 for nuclear and 1,000 for simple cycle. Capital cost of our capacity is 3,500. So in the data center world, what the data center needs is 50 kW of nuclear at $9,000 or $450,000 in cost allocation. But with the capacity averaged together, they need 50 kW of capacity at a 3,500 kW cost, and they get assigned 175,000, not 450,000. They pay less than half of what it costs or the kind of resources that they need because of the averaging that occurs in cost allocation studies. And the rest of us pick up the balance of the bill to serve them. That is, they get the advantage of the low capital cost peaking resources, even though that's not the kind of resources that they need. Now, as far as I'm concerned, wind, solar, and storage are the only answer to data center power needs. It takes, by the time you take the design, engineering, equipment lead time, and construction time, 10 years or maybe longer to build a nuclear plant. Because of very long equipment lead time, the factories that make turbines are backed up 4 and 5 years. It's now taking 5 or 6 years to build a combined cycle power plant, 3 years to build a simple cycle power plant. A lot of that is, again, the backup in the factories, but 2 years or less to build wind and solar. That's the only way we're going to be able to add a lot of capacity to our system quickly. China is building 1,000 megawatts of solar per day. That's essentially the state of Nebraska every day in the capacity. Every day. They're building 1,000 megawatts of wind a week, and they're installing 1,000 megawatts of batteries a week. We're plodding along at about 1/5 or 1/6 the pace of China in wind, solar, and batteries. The answer is real simple. Bring your own new clean energy. It's the only way we can make sure that the data centers cover the cost and the risk of the resources they're asking us for. And by including in the risk, the environmental risk of operating dirty resources. So I'm a big fan of the Beyonce principle. I'm not that big a fan of Beyonce herself. And this is the group that Liz and Kyle and I participate in is crowdsourcing a paper on ratepayer impacts of data centers, and we're asking people who have them to give us examples of data centers that are being built, other papers that are being written, examples of best practices, and even to join in the authorship. So with that, I'll shut off my sharing, and if there's questions, we can talk, and if there's not, we can go back to doing this stuff.
Oh my gosh, Jim. Yeah, as I said in the chat, you continue to blow my mind. Let's open it up for questions.
Yeah, so I really appreciate your ending message there and the slide looking at, years to in service date, looking at the different technology types. So our electeds in Missouri are really big on nuclear. And I've just kind of been rolling my eyes going to all these different meetings and hearing them talk about it, of, seeing what you're seeing there and the long lead time, going over schedule, going over budget. So, other than political pressure, do you have an idea as to why nuclear is being talked about again? Because it clearly isn't working in terms of deployment speed.
It's a cult. It's a flippin' cult. And the cult thinks that wind and solar are evil and that nuclear is good. And there have been cults throughout history. We fought the Crusades over hundreds of years, trying to recapture the Holy Land. And thousands and thousands of wealthy landowners donated their sons and their treasure to that pursuit. And as far as I'm concerned, what's going on right now with nuclear is incredibly irrational. It costs too much, it takes too long, and carries considerable risk, some of which are known and some of which are unknown. It can't be built quickly. If it could, uh, it would, but it can't, so it won't. Uh, there's no evidence that it's ever going to be cheap. Uh, but the cult is being fed by an adequately financed team of very good public relations folks. Uh, and it's not just Missouri. I mean, we've got nuclear legislation. My state hosted a public power agency that tried to build 5 nuclear plants in the late 70s and early 80s. Their budget went from $4 billion to in 1979 to $24 billion in 1981 for the 5 plants. 4 of the 5 were stopped. One of them was finished. That one is operating. It's one of the most expensive power, produces the most expensive power in the region, but it operates. And the utilities that were signatories to Washington Public Power Supply System, nearly went bankrupt. And they were saved by a court decision that ruled the contracts that obligated them to pay for the unfinished power plants invalid, which triggered the largest municipal bond default in American history at the time. $2.25 billion of bonds were defaulted on. That led to a securities fraud litigation. Ultimately, the players in the region, not just the utilities, agreed to a $750 million settlement with the bondholders. Bondholders lost 2/3 of their investment. That saved the utilities from bankruptcy. We had half a dozen rural co-ops that had bought big shares of these nuclear plants, and there's no way they could afford to pay them off. There was just nothing resembling the power demand or the economic strength in their communities to cover the costs they'd committed to. They got saved by the court decision. Those same utilities are championing nuclear today. So we're seeing it all over the country, and it's just extraordinarily good public relations on the part of the nuclear industry, coupled with a anti-wind and solar. I mean, there's a pro-nuclear cult, and it's pretty much the same people as the anti-wind and solar cult. And I can't describe it as anything other than there's no. And from my perspective, there's somebody who did his master's thesis on the official bond statements of the Washington Public Power Supply System and dug into how they fabricated their numbers and lied to the bond market. I can't explain it in any other way.
Well, I appreciate your thoughts. That makes me feel more sane.
And look at it. I mean, as I said, China is building 1,000 megawatts of solar a day, 1,000 megawatts of wind a week, 1,000 megawatts of storage a week. All those technologies were invented here. The high voltage DC transmission that China is using to bring that power to their communities was invented here. We basically gave China a clean, reliable, affordable power system on a silver platter. And we have a cult in this country that's now telling us to come home and eat off of lead glazed clay plates, much like the Romans did 2,000 years ago when they thought they were on top of the world. It's just goofy. We have people who are busily working on producing a suicidal response of the U.S.
Yeah, the interest in nuclear blows my mind too. This is Liz. I mean, I think one other thing I would add is just, and maybe this is obvious from what Jim was saying, but like when you are spending 10, 20, 30 billion dollars on something, it's really easy for a lot of people to make a lot of money and just skim money off of the top there. And I think that has happened in the
Yeah.
past.
Let me say something. There's two different things happening in nuclear. There's Microsoft and others paying to resurrect previously closed nuclear plants in the East. Uh, and I actually think that's rational. Those power plants were closed because there was no market for the power at a cost to keep them running. And that was true in part because there was no internalization of carbon costs in those markets. If there'd been a $50 a ton carbon tax in Pennsylvania, 3 Mile Island 2 never would have shut down. They simply couldn't make money competing with coal and natural gas in the marketplace, and the owners did the rational thing and shut them down. But in New York and Illinois, where they've implemented a carbon compensation mechanism, or in Washington, where we've adopted a carbon tax, the nuclear plants are able to keep running. I think it's rational for the data companies to be trying to bring those nuclear plants back online. I think it's rational for them. That is, the power that those plants will produce is the kind of power data centers need, continuous power, which is the kind of power the rest of us mostly don't need. We use varying amounts of power during the day. We prefer flexible generation or generation that has storage attached to it. And the costs are operating an existing plant are not outrageous. But so that part of it I think is rational. Uh, I don't have expertise on whether it's safe, and that's a considerable concern. But building new nuclear as far as I'm concerned, is just goofy. I mean, there's just no evidence anywhere that they will be economic. The most well-respected analyst, Lazard, who are, I guess, cousins of mine, of the Jewish moneylenders across Europe, Lazar in Eastern Europe, Lazzaroni in Italy, Lazard Fairs in France, Salazar's in Spain. So they're cousins of mine. But they show new nuclear costing twice as much as wind and solar, as new utility scale wind and solar, maybe 3 times as much, and significantly more even than offshore wind, which is a realistic option on the East Coast, where the onshore wind and solar resources are not particularly attractive. There's just no evidence that new nuclear is likely to become cost effective. In theory, if they could produce power plants in factories and stamp them out one after another, the cost could come down. But the reason that nuclear plants got very big is because that's where the economies of scale were. And the idea that somehow small ones are going to be more economic is not a position that's supported by history.
Well, thank you for all of that. And thinking about, how utilities are actually going to respond, I've seen many throughout Missouri talking about natural gas plants to be able to meet the new load. And some of them were talking about that before the, concerns or projections for AI and data centers coming online. Do you think that's still going to be the case? We're just going to see a mixture of natural gas, wind, and solar and storage, because clearly nuclear is going to miss the timeline by, a decade, and that's being generous.
Well, Google has put $40 million into new nuclear, but they put $40 billion into new wind and solar around the world. So, these are smart companies. So they're doing that. Just last week, it was announced that Amazon had outbid the local utilities for a large, very large solar facility under construction in Oregon, which is going to make it hard for my utility, which was the number two bidder. It's going to make it hard for them to meet their load requirements and their decarbonization obligations. And I think we're going to see more of that. But in Texas, we're seeing data centers being built where they're building on-site wind and solar. And they will connect to the grid, and they will connect to the grid and sell power into the grid and reduce AI data training during the hours when grid prices are very high. They will buy power from the grid when the prices are very low, but they'll be market interactive, and they'll have the variable output of their wind, the variable output of their solar, the ability to control how hard they run their data center, and a power market to connect to. On the other hand, the Donald J. Trump data center that's being built in North Texas with planned to have four large nuclear plants built. Uh, uh, it will be being led by former Energy Secretary in the first Trump administration. It'll be 12 years before they can produce any nuclear power. That's three iterations of the insides of a data center. The equipment they put in a data center after 3 or 4 or 5 years is obsolete, and they tear it out and put in new stuff. Who can predict what that data center's power needs will be 12 years from now? That's now if there's a cult that's willing to invest that money, I don't mind watching that cult lose their money. And if in fact, Amazon and Microsoft are planning to directly fund some new nuclear construction, I'm actually comfortable with that. If they want to put their own money in and see if we can prove up a resource, I'm not opposed to that. I don't want to see the public put at risk to produce what looks to be a very expensive resource to supply what may be a very fickle customer.
Well, Jim, as an economist, I'm curious. I just posted a link in the chat, and this is from the trade journal Data Center Dynamics, where they're quoting IBM CEO as saying there's no way for gigawatt data centers to turn a profit. And like a lot of your facts and figures, I've been getting a lot of mileage out of this one. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Does that fact check?
I think the data centers probably can turn a profit. But right now, they are in a race to a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. 90% of the gold miners who went to the Klondike in Alaska came home busted. But some of them got very wealthy. And basically, the first guy to get to the mother lode gets the gold. And that's the race that these companies are in right now. The promise of AI is considerable. I'm become quite a believer in the value of the technology. I've looked at some of the things that have been done for a friend of mine who had a scan because she was having abdominal pain, and her gastroenterologist was looking for lumps. And they didn't see lumps. But the AI review of her scan actually found not the lump that was causing her abdominal pain, but found very, very early pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer is almost always deadly. Judy is doing fine because her cancer was caught so early they were able to remove it. That is a direct result of a experimental AI scan, a review of her scan at the University of Washington Hospital. there's a lot of they're able now to reduce the cost of bringing drugs to market by a factor of 10 by doing most of the testing virtually. They're able to find drug interactions between people who are taking multiple drugs much more quickly when there's only a few people having certain drug interactions. The smart pharmacists don't always find them, but the all-knowing AI bots do. Uh, I really believe, I think that thinking is generally a good thing to do, and that more thinking is probably going to be better. So I'm optimistic about the technology. I'm not resistant to it. Uh, but we shouldn't build power plants faster than we're building data centers, and utilities are trying to do that. We shouldn't expect other people to pay for the power plants and transmission that are being built for data centers. They can afford to pay for it themselves. They got more money than the power companies got. Uh, and they're willing to take the risk. They're also, when they get surveyed, they're willing to pay a lot more for power than other industries are. They're not intimidated by 15 and 20 and 25 cent a kilowatt hour electricity. Whereas I've spent a whole career dealing with industrial customers who were fighting over every 10th of a cent on their power bills. These folks are planning to use this power to produce a sellable product. I want to get in their way, but I do want to make sure that they pull the whole wagon that's needed to enable them.
Thank you for the insight and the inspiration, Jim. Anyone else got questions?
I was impressed by the IBM CEO's comment. What he basically said was they're planning to spend $6 trillion on data centers, and you've got to generate $600 million a year, $600 billion a year of free cash flow from that. And he said, don't see any way they can get there. And frankly, as a result of that, I sold almost all of my U.S. large cap stocks in my IRA and have invested all that money in overseas companies and in small caps. Because that very interview impressed me.
Thank you, Jim. And in the chat, Gwen has also posted a great resource link. By the way, sneak preview, Gwen is a potential future speaker. Hopefully, Gwen and her organization, this is Frac Tracker and now Data Center Tracker, are potential guest speakers for our February 25th meeting. Gwen, if you have a moment, I'd love for you to go on and introduce yourself and give us a sneak preview.
Yeah, sure. Hey, folks. My name's Gwen. I am based a little bit north of Ann Arbor, Michigan, if you know where that is. And yeah, I work for this organization called Frac Tracker Alliance. We map and analyze oil and gas data pretty broadly. But a lot of our partner organizations started contacting us as soon as these data centers started coming in, the hyperscale ones, about a year ago. And so we started creating a map to try and track some of these developments. It's definitely a little bit tricky. I'm sure I don't have to tell folks here that there are a ton of data gaps related to what we know about data centers. But yeah, and what I shared in the chat, it was a local panel on data centers, specifically talking to residents of a municipality about the risks of data center. But some of what Jim was saying made me think of some of what Prescott, one of the members on that panel, was talking about, which is just kind of likening this data center expansion to the dot-com boom. And there were a lot of companies then that were really trying to make a name for themselves, and a lot of those companies don't exist anymore, and we're left with some big ones. So So I think that comparison can be helpful for me at least to think about, which is why I wanted to share it with folks. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I know we're closing on the hour, but any last minute questions for Jim or Gwen or anyone else here? And our regular schedule next week will be an information meeting, but hope to hear more from Gwen on the 25th.